It's the week ending Saturday, the 14th of November, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Donald Trump refusing to concede the presidential election, the Welsh Government cancelling exams for students next year, and Pfizer announcing a COVID-19 vaccine that's 90% effective. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Joe Evans, from the Week Junior editor Felicity Capon, and returning to the show, freelance journalist Abdul Tahhan. Abdul, you're starting the show this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is this the week we see the launch of Putin as the peacemaker?
Today, on November 9th, Azerbaijani President Aliyev, Armenian Prime Minister Pashinyan, and the Russian President signed a statement declaring a total ceasefire and all military activities in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict zone at midnight Moscow time on November 10th.
Russian President Vladimir Putin speaking on Monday. So Russia has brokered a peace deal between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Abdul, this was largely ignored by British media outlets. So what are the details?
So the details is that this is a conflict that has so far killed over 1,200 civilians and military personnel from two sides. Obviously, the majority of the people were killed in the Armenian territories. The conflict started 6 weeks ago between Azerbaijan and Armenia in the territory called Karabakh, which internationally it's recognized as Azerbaijan's land. But Armenian people have been living there. The majority of the Armenian people who've been living there consider it as Armenian land. And since 1994, they have been in control of it. But now, after almost 25 years, Azerbaijan decided to take it back and launch its war.
And so what actually did Russia broker between the two nations?
It's very interesting that Russia was playing a couple of roles here. So Russia was providing arms to both countries, Azerbaijan and Armenia. And Russia has a military base in Armenia itself and had an agreement with Armenia, but couldn't really risk the precautions of taking the side of Armenia because they needed to sell more weapons to Azerbaijan and more oil and gas that go through Azerbaijan land. So Russia, what they did here is that they made the two sides agree on a peace deal. And the peace deal was that Russia will now send peacekeepers, interestingly, to monitor the ceasefire. And all the land will now go back to Azerbaijan. And Armenia gets to keep part of the land. Displaced people and refugees will be able to go back to their lands and their territories after being displaced for many years.
And Felicity, as Abdul was suggesting in his little tease into the clip there, this is an example of Russia playing peacekeeper, sort of, although as Abdul was saying, they've also been selling arms to both sides. And Putin has long wanted to project Russia's global power in that way, isn't it? Is this a sign that strategy could be working, almost despite Syria?
I'm not sure. I feel quite sort of sceptical of Russia's role in this conflict, really. I think the fact that it's selling arms to both sides and the idea that it was sort of has this defence pact with Armenia, and yet Armenia seems to come off very, very poorly from this deal, really. There's huge amounts of anger and sadness and distrust amongst Armenian over this. It makes me wonder. And I think also within this whole conflict, what you have to remember is just how unevenly matched Azerbaijan and Armenia are. So for Armenia, it really is the underdog story, tiny army, much more limited resources. You had 17-year-olds propping up the Armenian army in this conflict up against the might of Azerbaijan and Turkey. And you can sort of see why, in some ways, this peace deal in some ways is a good thing because people were dying, but it's also seen as a total capitulation and a surrender and a defeat for Armenia, who are, a very, very proud people who have a very, very long history of huge amounts of abuse and persecution. So I'm not quite sure that the Armenians would sort of see Russia as their big ally who've come to their help. But I mean, wider than that, you haven't really seen the international community at all come to Armenia's aid. And I think, there is that fear that under cover of pandemic, when the world has its back turned and is sort of focusing on this vaccine, what might happen next? What is the long-term goal here? What could Azerbaijan now build upon? And I think that's a huge worry for Armenia, actually.
And Joe, there must have been, some happy Armenians that, as Felicity says, people aren't dying. But if you looked at the news coverage that there was, all the video footage basically, and there's hardly anything from Azerbaijan, all the video footage was essentially angry, embarrassed Armenians taking to the street saying, we want to carry on fighting, basically. We shouldn't have signed this deal.
No, you're quite right. And we ran a photograph of the day not long ago on theweek.co.uk of a very, very angry Armenian veteran protesting in Yerevan, the capital. Protesters actually stormed the national parliament and dragged the speaker out into the street. They looted the prime minister's office. As you say, by contrast, the footage coming out of Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, was citizens celebrating. Windows were smashed in the capital in Armenia, and police officers essentially were just looking on as some veterans, even wearing military fatigues, started delivering their own speeches. They essentially seized control of the national parliament for a short period of time, voicing their anger. As Felicity says, they're a very, very proud people, and the idea that they have abandoned their land is not something that they're going to be hugely able to reconcile with their proud history.
So, Abdul, why did the Armenian Prime Minister sign this deal then?
Well, there are a number of reasons why the Prime Minister, even though he's a proud Armenian, just like anyone else around the world, I've never seen people who are not proud, a proud nation of themselves, but the Prime Minister signed this deal. He cited a couple of sources saying that military personnel at the front line were telling him to sign because they did not have the capacity to fight Azerbaijan, and they were overwhelmed with the Azerbaijani army. So that's mainly the reason. But the people who were angry for a couple of reasons, they've been saying that the media has lied to them for over 6 weeks because all the news, pretty much a lot of news was coming positive.
And there's a religious element to all of this too, isn't there? Which I think it would be an oversight not to mention. So essentially the majority of Armenians are Christian, the majority of Azerbaijanis are Muslim, right? Is it even more complicated than that though?
I think it is a little bit more complicated because this conflict does not stop in Azerbaijan, in Armenia. It extends. I'm from Aleppo, I'm from Syria, and I've got a lot of, in Aleppo we have the largest Armenian community in Syria. And a lot of these people, a lot of Armenian people, the proud people of Armenia, did not really protest against Assad. So this was seen as a kind of a negative reaction to the uprising against Assad. So a lot of people in my circle now, when the conflict started, and the way it was reported by media in Arabic countries, that this is kind of a Muslim-Christian conflict. So a lot of people were taking sides, even though they didn't know any Armenian or any Azerbaijani, just based on the nationality, based on a religious, and based on some political views and attitudes from certain people in certain geographical place.
Felicity, does Armenia have any friends in the region then? I mean, presumably the affinity of Syrian Armenians to Syria was that Assad was, being kind to them, essentially, by comparison. They are
one of these populations that, as I was saying before, have undergone such persecution, that when they have found new homes, just the kind of opportunity to settle there and live peacefully and kind of be able to have their cultures and their traditions and their music and their food and all that has been so sort of rarely afforded to them in their very long history that you can kind of see how they haven't always got involved in wider protests in the regions where they have sort of ended up. I think they have sort of seen themselves as sort of us against the world for quite understandable reasons. I noted that there's been a huge outpouring actually from France and from Los Angeles, which have big sort of Armenian populations. That's where the diaspora is kind of strongest. And I thought that was very interesting to note that it was Los Angeles and France who were sort of the two parts of the world that were engaging in this news story when other places weren't. But I think that is, when you talk about friends and who came to their rescue and who came to their aid, I think that it was limited, and that sort of is part of the story of the Armenians, really.
And Joe, I came to you with this exact question about Afghanistan last week, so it's a bit unfair really to land it on you twice, but where do you think this is going, let's say in 10 years' time? I mean, the last major conflict between these two countries ended in 1994, but it's obviously been bubbling under since then. Do you think we'll still be dealing with the repercussions of this in a decade?
Yes, and you mentioned that you asked me the same question about Afghanistan last week. I think it's actually more accurate to relate this back to a conversation we had about the Balkans about 2 months ago, that these tensions that bubble away based upon very, very deep-rooted, often cultural and historical basis don't tend to simmer off, and this doesn't look as if it will either. In the short term, it's a massive win for Azerbaijan. They've managed to regain a lot of the territory that they lost in the conflict you mentioned there in the 1990s. And also, as Abdul mentioned at the beginning, they're also going to be able to relocate lots of ethnic Azeri refugees back into the region. It's also a success for Turkey, which was briefly mentioned earlier, which supported Azerbaijan's campaign and has had its role and prestige in the region enhanced. And also for Moscow, who have expanded their footprint into Azerbaijan in the South Caucasus. And it's actually the last area on sort of Europe's border that they didn't have military presence, which they now do. In terms of what this looks like in the next 10 years, there's questions to be raised of international organisations that were set up precisely to prevent this kind of thing. The UN has once again voiced its concern, as it tends to do, about almost everything without really mobilising itself. And also the European Union, as in the Balkans in the early 1990s, has remained fairly quiet on yet another conflict on its borders that it doesn't seem to wish to get involved in.
Yeah. And Abdul, this is your story. Is there anything you'd like to add to that in terms of repercussions for the world?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So one thing I would like to add here is that even though it might sound good that a peace deal has been reached, but you have to remember, imagine that there was a peace deal now with Assad. A lot of Syrian people would be extremely angry because Assad has done a lot of crimes against humanity and killed a lot of people. So imagine that there's a peace deal now takes place in Syria and people get asked to go back to Syria. How would that make him feel? Now, I don't know which one is worse, staying in a war and risking more people getting killed and losing their houses and their loved ones, or having a peace deal with the killer who was responsible for their displacement and them losing loved ones and houses and homes in the first place. So it's not really a great choice between these two.
Joe, you're up next after this. Okay, Joe, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Should we have faith in public health restrictions?
We belong to a community that thrives on physical proximity and constant interaction at weddings, at bar mitzvahs, 3 times a day at the prayer. We go to the same kosher restaurants, the same grocery stores. Our kids go to the same schools. We all meet each other, know each other, and it's one interactive circle.
Abraham Berkowitz, a Hasidic rabbi living in Brooklyn, speaking to the New York Times about life in lockdown back in April. Joe, what's happened this week?
So yes, as you mentioned, that was a rabbi based in New York. But what happened this week is that several thousand people in Jerusalem joined a funeral procession for the fairly prominent American rabbi David Feinstein. This was in a direct violation of the coronavirus lockdown rules in Israel, and it led to clashes with police. 2 people were arrested and police cars were damaged during the scuffles. The crowd was predominantly made up of ultra-Orthodox Jews, many of them actually Americans. But it's not the first example of ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities running into issues with COVID lockdown rules, which they found very, very difficult to reconcile with their particular way of life.
Yeah, there was a fascinating piece about this, wasn't there, by Shmuel Rosner in the New York Times last month. Tell us what it said.
Yes, so Shmuel Rosner pointed out a couple of examples of this. For example, in early October, Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, ordered schools to close in areas with large ultra-Orthodox Jewish populations because of large coronavirus outbreaks. And some of those schools refused, which meant that they had to threaten to withdraw funding from the schools in order to get them to shut. And at the same time, in Israel, a rabbi commanded his followers to open ultra-Orthodox schools, also in defiance of shutdown orders. So it's kind of this example of 2 countries on sort of opposite sides of the Atlantic with 2 different systems of government with the same challenge, essentially, which is how to reconcile living under lockdown or living through the pandemic with deeply held religious beliefs held by large and close-knit communities.
Yeah, I mean, Felicity, Shmuel Rosner in that piece was at pains to point out all the things he finds to admire in the community spirit of ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities and their preservation despite persecution and all the rest of it. But I mean, the bottom line is right now we're all supposed to be staying away from each other, and kind of bubbling under what he was saying in that piece, it seemed to me, was their refusal to do that as a very visible group might in itself cause anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I was reading a foreign policy piece that seemed to sort of say that these ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities are sort of saying, well, hang on a moment, this is unfair that you're going after us, and sort of alleging some anti-Semitism, which may or may not be the case. But the sort of foreign policy article was hitting back by saying, well, you have sort of chosen this way of life, and you have sort of chosen to turn your backs on sort of integrating and sort of being part of the modern world. So you can see in these communities that, there's sort of no computers, there's no internet, there's a lack of English being spoken. A lot of the education is sort of purely religious texts, so no sort of scientific education. There's suspicion of outside communities, and that's again sort of history of persecution, which is understandable. But these communities, they see their kind of, prayer meetings and religious groupings and coming together as completely essential to their way of life, and therefore lockdown just doesn't work. What struck me though was I thought it was so interesting that in some ways the pandemic has been blamed on how interconnected we all are, and sort of flying all over the world, and all the ways that we're so interconnected, and yet actually it's not just our modern ways of life that have brought about this pandemic and this lockdown, but even the really old ways of life that, these ultra-Orthodox communities sort of wanting to, be very steadfast in how they live their lives. That's also causing so many people to die.
And you can see, can't you, Abdul, that it's just a bit of a tightrope, I suppose, for legislators to deal with this, because obviously in New York, they're a minority, and in Israel, obviously, Jews aren't a minority, but ultra-Orthodox Jews are and are seen as a minority. And so there's a feeling that even as the minority grows in strength and, they have a lot of kids, those ultra-Orthodox families, nonetheless, it's not a good look for the government to be saying, stop doing what you're doing.
I think this is one of the cases that the majority rights is more important than the minority rights in the way that they see it. In a lot of places, faith leaders have spoken about being attacked or being chosen as to sacrifice the way they live and integrate into the society. For example, the Muslim leaders in England at the day before the lockdown in July, they said that the lockdown was actually a way to stop Muslims from celebrating Eid, one of the biggest holidays in Muslim calendar. So this is kind of the same thing, but I don't think the government is out there to get these people. But these, the pandemic, these coronaviruses do not discriminate against people. And whether people like it or not, whether they have faith or not, they would have to act in the for what's best for the majority rights.
I also wonder whether it's a case that in these ultra-Orthodox communities, the way they've been doing things has been going on for so long and is such a sort of permanent feature. And I wonder whether there's that fear from religious leaders that if some of their followers slack off, would they leave the community? Would these communities break down? If your sort of way of life is dominated by a cycle of prayer and study and mass gatherings and that's halted for even a few weeks, and if there's suddenly access to internet or there's an opening up, what would the consequences be? Would you see young ultra-Orthodox followers leaving this way of life?
I guess as well, Joe, for this particular sect of ultra-Orthodox Judaism, there is a belief that studying the Torah is more important than everything else. That is what you are put on earth to do, procreate and read the Bible. And comparisons have been made with the burial of the former Chief Rabbi Lord Sachs this week, who was obviously an Orthodox Jew, but not an ultra-Orthodox Jew, a conservative Jew. That was done in accordance with British law. There were a congregation of, I think, 30 people there, and then it was uploaded to YouTube for the wider community to see. That isn't something that ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities will be prepared to do, because they think being at the funeral of their rabbi is the most important thing they can do, and it's basically more dangerous in their view than coronavirus to ignore the command from God. I mean, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, it should be said actually that some ultra-Orthodox communities have been willing to flex with the lockdown rules, and actually the example in the clip at the beginning if you watch the full video, there is an example of a ultra-Orthodox gentleman who did attend a burial via live stream in his car. And it should also be said that this isn't an issue that is only kind of applicable to the ultra-Orthodox community. There's examples, for example, in Florida, of pastors refusing to shut Christian churches, and the state Republican governor there, Ron DeSantis, issued an executive order saying that the churches didn't have to shut, basically arguing that religious services are essential activities. So it's not as sort of... Ultra-Orthodox communities are very visible, which means that... And they also live in very densely populated areas, which means that it's kind of been an issue that has been noted in those communities, but it isn't specific to ultra-Orthodox Jews. I think the wider issue really, as you say, Olly, is that being an ultra-Orthodox Jew is so central to your sense of identity that it's very difficult to convince them to change their behaviour because of the pandemic. And also it should be noted that they do have quite reasonable suspicion of outsiders. 70 years ago there was a suggestion that the ultra-Orthodox community may be wiped off the face of the earth by the Holocaust. They don't tend to engage with secular media. There is a suspicion of science and of outsiders, all of which is rooted in this near wipeout of the group. And so you can see why a sudden demand to change their behaviour, especially by outsiders, scientists, politicians, and not religious leaders, would lead them to do things like refuse to wear masks and evade testing. It's a mindset we can't understand, but if you do your very best to do so, you can see where the issue comes from.
But having said that, and I don't disagree with anything you've just said, I do wonder whether, with the pandemic or without the pandemic, whether this way of life is sustainable, whether to kind of close yourself off. I mean, just in terms of entering the workforce and sort of rising out of cycles of poverty, whether, even if we didn't have this pandemic, even if we didn't have this lockdown, whether this way of life is sustainable. And I think that's also a question that's worth asking.
Although it's interesting, isn't it, that during lockdown, many of the things that many secular people have been saying about spending more time with their family and, more time with nature and all the rest of it are actually closer to Haredi Judaism than they are to most people's way of life the rest of the time. Abdul, I want to be careful not to equate a religious belief with extremist groups here, but just looking wider for a second, how have other groups reacted to the pandemic?
2020 is the year where we've seen a lot of weird stuff. ISIS is following the World Health Organization guidelines and asking its supporters and its terrorists to stay away from Europe because of the coronavirus spread out. So I didn't expect to see that because I thought that they would treat it like Trump saying it's a hoax. If God said it's going to happen, it's going to happen. So, but yeah, even the most extreme religious groups in there, terrorist groups, are following World Health Organization guidelines, in which they were in conflict against for many, many years. Now, I don't know what's going to happen next. Being invited to the national security table to negotiate peace, I don't know.
On a much more parochial basis, Felicity, I suppose one of the lessons of coronavirus is it does actually help when community leaders of whatever community we're discussing and whatever we think of them are themselves involved in spreading the government's message. It can't all be top down. It has to be localised.
Yeah, completely. I think especially in ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities, it's the rabbis who have the authority and the respect, and people in these communities will do what the rabbis say, not the politicians. And in Israel there have been huge protests against Netanyahu this year. So I think you're absolutely right that there does have to be a confluence and an agreement between politicians and faith leaders to get the best possible results, and that's something that you haven't seen in different parts of the world this year.
Okay, Felicity, you're up next after this. Felicity, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Once upon a time, there was a beautiful, hopeless princess, but then an algorithm came along to set the story straight.
A 7-foot-tall bronze version of the famous sculpture Medusa with the head of Perseus was unveiled today at Manhattan's Collect Pond Park. The statue is the work of artist Luciano Garbati and was created as a response to Benvenuto Cellini's original work from the 16th century. Garbati says this reverses the traditional narrative of Medusa and is a tribute to the Me Too movement. The sculpture purposely faces the New York County Criminal Court, where Harvey Weinstein was convicted of rape. The statue will be on view through April of next year.
A report from CBS New York last month. Felicity, what's happened this week?
Yeah, so I'll come back round to Medusa. I'll swing back round to that because the actual...
If Holden was here, it would be an inevitability that we'd come back to classic literature at some point. But tell us what's happened this week.
So what's happening this week? It's hardly breaking news, I will admit, but I came across a story in The Independent. It's about a new book of fairy tales. They're no ordinary fairy tales, though. They are gender-swapped fairy tales written by Carrie Fransman and Jonathan Plaquette. And they decided to create an algorithm that would swap all the gendered language in any text. So he would become she, daughter would become son, etc., etc. And they took as their basis, I will get to that. They took as their basis an anthology of fairy tales, that the sort of classic fairy tales, Beauty and the Beast, etc., that had been published at the end of the 19th century, and applied their algorithm to see what would happen. And the results are really quite interesting and quite sort of profoundly uncomfortable and strange. So to give some examples, you've now got the Ugly Brothers, which I love. I think that's my personal favourite. Beauty and the Beast is now Handsome and the Beast. And actually the whole story sort of falls apart almost immediately because handsome as a noun has to work very hard and doesn't always succeed, whereas beauty, kind of sums up her entire identity is based on how she looks. And then you also have a lot of sort of predatory older women now appearing in the story, so sort of salivating over younger boys and saying, well, this young boy, the most beautiful creature I've ever seen. So I think
to return to my question, which you definitely swerved.
I definitely did.
Presumably the why is to show essentially that fairy tales are anti-feminist relics. We know that already, don't we?
It has been done before, and people writing reviews about this new book did sort of point that out and were sort of questioning, is this a bit of a gimmick, and have we sort of gone beyond needing to subvert fairy tales and expose them for what they are? But I do think this one is different and is worthy of discussion because of the application of the algorithm. They haven't changed the outcomes of the stories. I mean, they've used a really blunt tool. They haven't actually done much apart from apply this very blunt tool just to change the language. And I think you see, in a way that you haven't done before, in very stark relief, just sort of how wrong and weird these fairy tales are.
I mean, I found it interesting too, but I must say, Joe, like I was kind of suggesting there, I think we know that Cinderella's sexist and it's almost excusable because, it goes back hundreds of years. The problem as a dad when I read to my son is that I find, everyday sexism, if you like, in Roald Dahl. I find it in David Walliams. It's still being published now. Fairy tales and kids' books that subvert fairy tale structures are still sexist now.
Yeah, I mean, plainly, the core audience that this is aimed at is young people who haven't yet developed sort of the internalised gender prejudices that I'm sure we all carry around and don't necessarily recognise we carry. And the idea, as Felicity says, is to sort of try and subvert this idea of, Beauty and the Beast, beauty being her name and also the embodiment of everything she is without having to actually say or think or do anything to necessarily kind of establish herself. And, women being adventurers instead of kind of old cranks like ugly old women appearing in fairy tales. I think you're probably right that you're never going to write a sort of gender-neutral fairy tale because, I mean, I'm not sure that such a thing exists, and I'm not sure that sort of it's possible to kind of have a gender-neutral childhood unless you kind of are taken out of mainstream school and put in a cotton wrapped in plastic. What am I trying to say? Wrapped in bubble wrap. There we go.
I mean, a lot of the subversion, Abdul, depends on us understanding the fairy tales in the first place as part of our communal folk history, doesn't it? I mean, that's the joke of Shrek. That's the joke of Julia Donaldson's Zog. If you actually don't understand the original fairy tales, then you actually can't, in a way, understand a modern reinterpretation of them either.
Yeah, absolutely true. So in Syria and the Middle East, the most popular stories are Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, because these are from our countries, or Aladdin. But if I now imagine if I want to read these stories to my nephews and nieces, I wouldn't really read them because they're very they have a lot of values that I don't believe in. For example, they tell you that you should either be a prince or princess in order to do something. The way I look at it, it's very undemocratic. It's not only sexist, but very undemocratic. For example, Aladdin's Aladdin goes to marry he wanted to propose to the princess, but then her father acts like a dictator, like Saddam Hussein or Assad. He doesn't have a Supreme Court. He doesn't have any judges. He does everything he wanted, which is not a really good thing for little kids to learn. This is on one hand. On another hand, changing the words and saying, for example, instead of the Beauty and the Beast, the Handsome and the Beast is really not good for women in the Middle East, especially, for example, my auntie is a very gossipy woman. I remember once she was coming back from a wedding and she was describing the couple as Beauty and the Beast. So imagine now we change it. This would not be good for a lot of women in the Middle East. Like they would be called out, they're the beast from this story, or they're this, bad character or that character. So I don't think this would play in the hands of women in the Middle East, or especially in the bubble where I grew up.
There you go, Felicity. These so-called feminists haven't considered Abdul's auntie.
I think that's so fascinating to hear. I think what it comes back to in some ways, though, is that fairy tales, they are often the first stories children hear. And so it is sort of important, even though they sort of seem silly, and even though you and I can sort of point out all the sort of problematic things with them, they do play, I think, quite a huge role. And I think the independent piece was also quite good at pointing out how, as you were saying, Ollie, it's not just the fairy tales. We're still seeing that today with Disney, and there was a great link to I think it was like a video game of Batman and Catwoman, and sort of reversing those roles and sort of seeing how absurd it is when you suddenly switch the genders around.
Because Catwoman's depicted as basically a sexual creature who's constantly flirting and making references to milk, whereas Batman's a strong figure who goes out saving people. Exactly.
And I mean, as Jonathan Plaquette, he was the creative technologist behind this new book of fairy tales, he points out, he was sort of saying how, all of a sudden he had kings who were sitting by windows sewing and longing for a child, kind-hearted young men rewarded for looking past the flaws of beastly princesses. And even there was a review in The Guardian where the female journalist who was writing the piece said she had to sort of check her own unconscious biases, because she suddenly found it so bizarre that Little Red Riding Hood's father was making custards to give to Little Red Riding Hood, and she was saying, men don't make custards. So it just goes to show how completely ingrained all of this is.
But, I mean, as editor of The Week Junior, of course we don't want children to be defined by gender stereotypes. Completely get that. And of course, lots of little girls want to be police officers, etc., etc. But the bottom line is, fairy tales partly reflected the fact that lots of little girls do fantasize about having children of their own one day. That's why dollies are popular. Lots of little boys like the idea of riding to the rescue on a horse. I mean, those gender tropes are to some extent built into us too.
I agree. I hugely agree. But I think there's room for, and I was listening to a podcast the other day of a woman who had 3 little boys, and she was sort of like, a proud feminist and wanted to raise her boys to, be as interested as they were in, trucks and armies as they were in cooking and baking or whatever. And she said her boys, despite her best efforts, would just naturally gravitate to things that they would gravitate towards. And I completely agree that, if girls feel more maternal instincts and want to play with dolls and do baking, that's entirely fine too. But there is room for nuance and there is room for complexity, and you can have a little bit of both, and you can have this new book of fairy tales that shows things for how they really are.
Okay. Now, you gave this story an introduction with a clip about a statue of Medusa, and you promised to tie these loose ends together. So can you explain what that was and what's it got to do with this?
Well, this was the other story that is not from this week and is slightly older. It's from last month, actually. It's the unveiling of a statue of Medusa holding the head of a beheaded man in her hands. And it's made some waves because it's sort of similarly to the book of fairy tales. It's an effort to change the myth of Medusa and to change the story around to give her a happier ending. So the story of Medusa...
Right, so remind us what happens in the original.
So Medusa was a beautiful maiden who was raped by Poseidon in the temple of Athena. And Athena was horrified by this and so cursed Medusa, turning her into a Gorgon. And she was exiled and was transformed from a beautiful maiden into this monster with snakes all over her head. And Perseus sets off to chop off her head and succeeds. And the architect, who I believe is South American, decided to change the ending of the story and have Medusa sort of triumphantly brandishing this beheaded head in her hands. And it's just gone up in New York opposite the courtroom where Harvey Weinstein was on trial, and so it's sort of been seen as a token for the Me Too movement.
Except in the story she's raped by Poseidon, and then the bloke she's killed by switching the genders is just the guy that was sent out to kill her, but he hasn't done anything if she's killed him first, so it doesn't really have the same statement that it could if she was holding Poseidon's head, for example.
Yeah, and lots of people actually sort of, I think, have different interpretations of the myth anyway. I think some people just think, well, Medusa was just an awful monster and, you know, stop trying to make this into some sort of big feminist thing, and does it quite work and does it not? But it's still fascinating that, you know, if you walk past this statue for the first time and looked into it, you would get an entirely different understanding of the story of Medusa, basically. It has sort of changed it to that extent, regardless of whether it's completely accurate or not.
I think you could also possibly make the case that Perseus is the person sent out to kill Medusa in the story, who is the person that has been raped in the legend. And I guess there's a case to be made that in the case of the Me Too movement, it isn't just that the whole movement is about changing the discussion around, you know, the victims of sexual assaults and sexual offences. And there's an argument to be made that it's not just Harvey Weinstein that sort of defiles the name of these individuals that come forward, that it's also us and the public and the media and the people, that there is sort of a second layer of people that go out to you know, shun or treat these victims as, you know, responsible or not the victim. And in that sense, Perseus is the person sent out to kill Medusa. And there's an argument that in these cases there is sort of two waves. There's the original person that commits the crime like Weinstein, and there's the second wave in terms of the sort of media shame and public perception of these victims.
While we're all looking at these stories in the West from Western eyes, like for me, looking at it from someone who came from Syria, I think, you know, in a lot of stories, you wouldn't really hear about the gender roles in Arabic places or houses. For example, my auntie is the gossipy one, but then my dad loves to listen to her. So how does that make my dad? And then my dad at home, he's the one who cooks, and my mom doesn't cook. And she's the one who goes out most of the time.
So hold on, are you saying that actually Western fairy tale literature for children is more sexist than stuff that you'd get in Arabic culture? That is interesting.
It is very sexist. For example, you take Mulan. Mulan was a woman. Try to, now in China, right? Try to reverse the role. Would you reverse that role? Would you say, no, we're going to just reverse the men's role? Or would you say, oh, Mulan was a boy and he saved the whole country? It would be very interesting to look at that. So that's why I said that maybe this is good for Western people. And that's why they should keep their stories. But our stories, the Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, oh, I love it.
Well, we all lived happily ever after. That is it for this very equitable edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to noble and strong Felicity, evil Queen Abdul, and Princess Jo. We'll be back with more to unwrap next Friday. In the meantime, you can get up to speed on everything you've missed in the past month whilst following the US election just by subscribing to this podcast. Our past eps are all available now for free on your podcast app of choice. Just search for The Week Unwrapped. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.